What began as a revolution against kings and inherited power was, in part, engineered by men who quietly preserved their own dynasties. America's founding fathers are often lionized as men of vision, intellect, and fierce independence. But behind their polished legacies lies a deeper truth. Many were bound by more than political ideals. They were bound by blood, and not just the symbolic kind. Cousin marriages, carefully calculated alliances, and bloodline preservation were more than incidental. They were strategic. Take the Lees of Virginia. You may know Richard Henry Lee for boldly proposing American independence, but the Lee family's ambition reached beyond politics. They were one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in colonial America. Their cousins married into the Randolphs, the Carters, the Washingtons, even their own extended branches. This was no coincidence. The Lees believed in breeding power, just like their European counterparts. And they weren't alone. George Washington himself, though childless, was deeply enmeshed in this web. His marriage to Martha Dandridge Custis wasn't just a union of affection, it was a consolidation of wealth and status. But his extended family, the Washingtons, had long practiced what we might call domestic dynasticism. Several Washington cousins married one another over the generations, sometimes in first or second cousin pairings. It was accepted, expected, even. The goal wasn't genetic strength, it was political continuity. These families weren't inbred by accident. In early America, social status was fragile. Landowners, planters, and legal elites had to keep their assets close. And the only thing more secure than property was blood. Marrying within the family ensured not only that wealth didn't leave the clan, but that no rival family gained too much power. In the North, families like the Adams played similar games. John Adams' son, future President John Quincy, married Louisa Johnson, a cousin through extended ties. The ties weren't always direct, but they were always deliberate. Sometimes the results were troubling. The Custis family, Martha Washington's line, saw repeated instances of congenital issues. In some cases, children were born frail, suffered from seizures, or died young. Quietly, these tragedies were mourned behind closed doors, buried in family cemeteries, and rarely spoken of in the historical record. After all, America was supposed to be different from Europe, enlightened, rational, free from aristocratic rot. But aristocracy has many forms, and in America, it often hid behind names like Harrison, Randolph, and even Jefferson. Yes, Thomas Jefferson. His family line, too, was marked by intermarriage. He married Martha Wales Skelton, whose ancestry looped back into Virginia's most prominent bloodlines. Their shared relations with the Epps and Randolph families meant their children inherited a tightly woven web of political and genetic connections. These weren't accidents. They were the result of carefully managed unions. The more one studies Jefferson's letters and family documents, the more one sees a man concerned not just with liberty, but with legacy. A legacy secured, in part, through blood. The Randolphs, perhaps the most inbred American dynasty, took this to extremes. By the 19th century, their family tree resembled something closer to a circle than a branching oak. Cousins married cousins for generations. In one documented case, a Randolph child was born with such severe cognitive and physical disabilities that he was never publicly named. Only scattered references in letters reveal his existence. His mother, a first cousin to her husband, reportedly suffered emotional collapse following the birth. She was quietly institutionalized, a story that never made it into the textbooks. And it wasn't just physical deformities. Many descendants of these interwoven families suffered from depression, hallucinations, and violent outbursts. In a letter from a Carter family matron to her sister, she writes, "Little Edward sees things again. The doctor says it's the fevers, but I know not. Some modern historians now believe these could have been early signs of hereditary mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or epilepsy, passed through generations of cousin marriages. Even America's greatest families could not escape the consequences of closed bloodlines. But the difference was, they rarely admitted them. In Europe, Habsburg deformities were sketched in official portraits. In America, they were erased. Children who didn't survive were simply labeled lost in infancy. Maladies were blamed on swamp fever, cholera, or divine punishment. The true culprits, shared genes and repeated unions, remain taboo. One of the most tragic examples came from the Jefferson Hemings descendants. While the question of Sally Hemings and her children was buried for centuries, recent DNA evidence has uncovered not only Jefferson's paternity, but a possible parallel between his legitimate and enslaved offspring. Inbreeding wasn't just for white dynasties, it was imposed too. Sally Hemings herself was Jefferson's wife's half-sister, making her children both nieces and stepchildren to Martha. The tangled branches of American bloodlines weren't always born of love or power, but sometimes of coercion and control. The pressure to marry within these dynasties also created misery for those who resisted. Letters from the 1700s and 1800s reveal the emotional toll. A Randolph daughter begged her father to allow her to marry a common man she loved. His reply was chillingly simple. Our line must remain unbroken. You are not a girl. You are a legacy. She never married. She died in a sanitarium at 34. America may not have crowned kings, but it built its own aristocracy. One enforced not by divine right, but by calculated marriage, elite schooling, and strategic landholding. At the top of this pyramid stood families so tangled in their own roots, they no longer grew. They circled back into themselves, generation after generation, until something began to break. Whether it was mental illness, child loss, or the slow collapse of their once grand houses, the legacy of inbreeding began to show. Today, we remember the founders as rational men of science and liberty. But their descendants remember something else: whispers of cousin blood, portraits taken down, children born with silent conditions. This is the untold story of America's bloodlines, a revolution born of ideals, but shaped, in part, by inbreeding. And this is just the beginning. By the 19th century, the American experiment had taken root. The revolution was over, the Constitution was ratified, and the first few generations of America's elite were growing into a self-sustaining aristocracy. But beneath the idealistic promise of democracy lay the festering remnants of something old, something the founding fathers had inherited from Europe and never quite cast off: dynastic preservation through intermarriage. The early republic saw an explosion of power consolidation among the same founding families who had steered the country into being. And while the political scene looked increasingly diverse on the surface, behind the curtains, the bloodlines were quietly curving in on themselves. In Virginia, the Randolphs, Carters, Pages, and Harrisons continued their tradition of intermarriage, repeating cousin-to-cousin unions that by then had become not just tradition but expectation. It wasn't simply a matter of keeping land in the family. The early American elite feared dilution, cultural dilution, class dilution, blood dilution. Just as European royals had once protected their noble lines with tightly arranged marriages, American aristocrats did the same. They were just quieter about it. The problem was, inbreeding doesn't stay quiet forever. By the mid-1800s, doctors in Virginia and Maryland began reporting an alarming number of nervous conditions among the children of elite families. What they were seeing were likely the effects of recessive genetic disorders, issues that become more pronounced when two people with shared ancestry have children. One family's private physician wrote in his notes, 3 sons and 1 daughter, all afflicted with trembling hands, unsteady gait, and melancholy demeanor. None of this reached the newspapers, of course. These families had the means to hide what others could not. In South Carolina, the Pinckney and Middleton families, the very architects of the Constitution and military leadership, maintained a tradition of consanguineous marriage as well. A Pinckney daughter was married off to her uncle's son in what was whispered to be a tidy and discreet arrangement. The result: their daughter, a girl named Sarah, reportedly suffered from seizures and speech delay. She was kept home, rarely seen in public. In later years, her journals reveal a chilling phrase repeated throughout: "My head is not my own." This phrase crops up repeatedly in journals from the 1800s. My head is not my own. The thoughts are not mine. Mother says we must not say these things aloud. These families, proud of their refinement and intellectualism, were haunted by the very legacy they were trying to preserve. The more they folded back into themselves, the more unstable their branches became. The Adams family, though better remembered for their intellect and public service, was not immune. Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy, married a relative. While the link was less direct, it contributed to a chain of mild cognitive and emotional difficulties in his grandchildren, noted in family correspondence. Letters referenced episodes, tendencies toward melancholy, and one unfortunate with a bent spine and no sense of direction. Today, some historians suggest mild neurodevelopmental disorders may have gone unrecognized, masked by genteel manners and the luxury of privacy. In rural Massachusetts, a lesser-known branch of the Adams line intermarried with cousins from the Quincy and Boylston clans, producing a generation of children with fragile health. One of them, Theodore, died at age 10 after what the family described as nervous decline. His mother never spoke publicly again. Whether from grief, shame, or her own deteriorating mental health, we can only guess. But the silence was telling. Another haunting case emerged from the Custis family, who remained central to American legacy through the Washington name. In the 1830s, 2 Custis cousins married in a grand estate wedding near Arlington. Within a decade, 3 of their 5 children were dead, and the remaining 2 were noted in family records as delicate and inclined to solitude. One reportedly spoke to mirrors, convinced his dead brothers were inside them. The surviving daughter was married off to a plantation heir, also a cousin, who died of unknown fever less than a year later. No children came of that union. These stories weren't told. They weren't supposed to be. The illusion of American greatness rested on self-reliance, on moral superiority over old-world corruption. But the same elite class that rejected monarchy had quietly replicated its worst traditions. They didn't build thrones, they built plantations and parlor rooms, filled with cousin brides and hidden children. The portraits they hung in drawing rooms showed sharp chins, straight backs, and intelligent eyes. But behind the oil paint was something else, a shared jawline, an overbite recurring generation after generation, eyes that didn't quite align, a hand always shaking just slightly. And just like in European monarchies, whispers of madness became part of these dynasties. In one northern family with links to both the Schuyler and Van Rensselaer clans, a son was said to believe he was being hunted by invisible soldiers. He shouts into the fireplace, a neighbor wrote, and we can hear him from the road. He was eventually institutionalized at the Utica State Lunatic Asylum under the name John Smith, likely to protect his family's reputation. His mother, sister to a congressman, never visited him again. It was in these quiet tragedies that the American aristocracy began to unravel, not from revolution or politics, but from within. As the country industrialized, new money rose from cities, and immigrant families challenged old hierarchies. The bloodlines that had once formed the foundation of American power began to thin out or fade altogether. Some tried to hide the
Subscribe to my
evidence,
channel.
destroying letters, altering family trees, even burying certain names. But the truth seeped through the cracks. By the early 20th century, eugenics movements began to emerge. Ironically, some descendants of these inbred dynasties championed the pseudoscience of racial purity, unaware, or perhaps knowingly silent, about their own genetic entanglements. They had once used family marriages to preserve power. Now they used science to validate what they had already done. It was not about strength. It was about control. The final insult was this. The very families who wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights also wrote themselves into genetic stagnation. Their names endure: Jefferson, Adams, Randolph, Custis, but their private stories often disappeared. They became monuments, not people, statues, not citizens. But behind every statue was a child who died too young, a daughter forced into cousin marriage, a son who went silent in adolescence and never returned to school. And still, we hold on to the myth that America was different, that our founders were enlightened, that our bloodlines were clean. But America was built by human beings, not myths. And some of those human beings, for all their intelligence and courage, made choices that echo to this day, not just in the words of their constitutions, but in the bones of their descendants. And so, as we peel back the polished portraits and carefully curated legacies of America's first families, we uncover a reality far more complex and far more human than we were ever taught. Behind the marble monuments and schoolbook names lie secrets of bloodlines bound too tightly, of children lost to silence, and of a legacy stained not just by power, but by biology. If this glimpse into the hidden history of America's founding families intrigued you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the darker truths history tries to forget. And tell us in the comments, which forgotten bloodline should we expose next? Until next time, stay curious and question everything.